Reparations has been a big story on both the campaign trail for the 2020 Democrats and also in Congress, where a hearing recently addressed the issue and each side got to say their piece.
National reparations policy is a moral, democratic, and economic imperative.
I feel a sense of anger where we are in the United States of America, where we have not had direct conversations about a lot of the root causes of the inequities and the pain and the hurt manifested in economic disparities, manifested in health disparities, manifested in a criminal justice system that is indeed a form of new Jim Crow.
Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And there is, of course, the shame of this land of the free, boasting the largest prison population on the planet, of which the descendants of the enslaved make up the largest share.
If we were to pay reparations today, we would only divide the country further, making it harder to build the political coalitions required to solve the problems facing Black people today.
Putting aside the injustice of monetary reparations from current taxpayers for the sins of a small subset of Americans from many generations ago, let me finish. The fair distribution of reparations would be nearly impossible once one considers the complexity of the American struggle to abolish slavery.
Our own Dominic Carter, he hit the streets of New York to get reaction, also speak with an expert at Columbia University.
Friday afternoon, a 90-degree summer day on 125th Street in Harlem. Reparations are a hot topic amongst almost all the Democrats running for president. Peter Taylor is visiting New York from San Diego.
And yes, personally, I do feel that we are owed, being that I am a descendant from an institution that was for 400 years that built this country up, made us the greatest country in the world, but we haven't been given our just due.
Claire Watkins says reparations should be explored.
Because I think it's a past that we need to help reconcile, and I think reparations is it's definitely, people have not been treated fairly, and they should.
It's been discussed, but it's time for it to manifest and be dispensed to the people who are entitled to it.
And who's entitled to it?
Brown and black people, African people, people who were brought here involuntarily.
To recognize the horror of enslavement, of forced labor, of murder, of torture, of rape, of family separations.
Reparations are a complex and thorny issue. Columbia University professor Katherine Franke is an expert teaching the topic of racial discrimination, a professor for the last 28 years.
Well, I'm delighted that pretty much every one of the Democratic candidates for the presidency has to have a position on this and is developing a thoughtful way to approach the question of reparations as part of a larger consideration of racial justice and healing in this society. I think part of why it's popped up into the Democratic campaigns is partly because we have prominent people of color, African Americans, running for president.
The professor's new book is on reparations. It's titled Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition. A common pushback against reparations, those that say they personally had nothing to do with slavery, so why should they pay?
Right. My family came to the United States well after the end of the Civil War. There's no one in my family who enslaved people, but that doesn't mean I haven't been a beneficiary of white supremacy and of a society that makes it much easier for people who look like me to gain an advantage, to get a loan, to get ahead in the economy, to get a job, to get a good education, and to not go to prison than it is for someone who looks like you, Dominic. And so while, of course, my family did not enslave people, I bear the responsibility for the failure to repair the horrible wound of slavery in this society. All white people do.
Professor Franke says America was already headed down the path for reparations for African Americans, and history changed course.
So the book describes what it means to be freed, but not free, and how there was an example in the 1860s of how reparations were so important and were granted to a number of freed people. And then once President Lincoln was assassinated and a new president came in, Andrew Johnson, the first thing he did was restore the land and the form of reparation that was given to freed people back to the people who had enslaved them, stolen from them. White households tend to have 10 times more in family wealth than black households do.
Studying reparations in Congress through what's called H.R. 40 is one thing, but atonement for America's slaveholding past could prove to be much more difficult.
We've, tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president.
So how would America's reckoning with slavery via restitution be carried out? Professor Franke says the answer is empowerment, rather than just cutting a check to individuals. She argues in her book that increasing the estate tax is the way to handle reparations, should it ever come to that.
Real estate was the greatest investment anybody in our country could have had in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and all you had to do was own land and sit on it and wait. African Americans never got in on that deal. And part of it is because we never apportioned land to them as reparations at the end of the Civil War. So what I recommend we do is increase the estate tax, put that money into a trust, and then fund collective remedial measures like community land trusts. There are community land trusts around the country that black communities are using as a way to control housing, control land use, actually create urban farms, become energy independent, and community land ownership is a way to build power and heal in the black community.
And Dominic joins me right here on set. All right, Dominic, 3 minutes, let's solve reparations. No, but it has become an election issue, as we've heard. It's probably discussed as seriously as I can remember in recent memory. You believe there are a place for reparations?
I absolutely do, Richard. Listening to Professor Franke, who is a renowned expert nationally on this, she strongly, white woman as we just saw, she strongly feels that there's a place for reparations. I fully support them when you look at the separation of black families, what happened during slavery, the rape, the labor, and so on. But here's the monkey wrench for me. How do you carry it out? How do you actually enforce it? How do you actually do it? Are you going to write a check? There are so many questions. And then when you add the Republican Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, we heard him basically say he doesn't support it. Basically, I don't see how it happens.
See, I remember in this country when we interned Japanese. In fact, it was something that many years later, President Reagan, I always respect him for this, apologized for that it was wrong for America to have done that. That said, though, to make it right, we had the living generation, in effect, or their immediate descendants, that we were able to, as a country, atone for with a payment. We are multiple generations separated. Now, if you can find some family that owned the plantation, and even though they weren't involved in slavery or the slave trade, that their family enjoyed some benefit from that stain in America, which was slavery, I guess you can make that connection even though they didn't participate in it. Or I look at a family like mine. Forget about not involved in the slave trade. We emigrated to this country basically, and many of them at least, after it had stopped. So how do you make the pot right if people aren't equally culpable, and also not every family can even attach themselves that they were descendants of slaves as well? So if you can't draw those familial lines, how would you ever have an equitable way to basically split the pot?
It's very convoluted, as you just expressed. But as Professor Franke argued just a second ago, and I think she makes a strong case. So let's put slavery in this box. But what about the box right here, Richard, of how blacks were treated from slavery current day? And quoting Professor Franke, I think she makes a strong case. White privilege. Okay? She told me a story off air of a prominent funeral home in Harlem, Benter's, owned by a black man. Went to the bank to get a loan, could not get the loan. His white friend went to the same bank, got the loan, and then gave the money to his friend to operate, which is now one of the preeminent funeral homes in Harlem.
But see, for me, once we get into that, well, we both know there's racism. You can look at certain data here. It's empirical. I get it, okay? But those become one-offs. What we're trying to say is you have I'd argue the stain in America, as I said before, slavery. We still struggle with this in 2019, the after effects of that, and obviously everything that went through to the Jim Crow years. It's hard to define after that exactly what was policy, what was just inherent racism. But there's a chapter in America where you could say this was intentionally done because of the color of their skin. People profited off of other people. But it's so many years later, forget the politics that it'll never pass because it won't. I just wonder how this would ever be made to be an equitable division. I had this debate once with our friend Charles Barron, who called me some words that I can't even say on TV because I said this, but it's much more complicated than I think people want to make it to be, certainly presidential candidates.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I also agree that it's never going to happen politically. But I'm also the same guy that thought that we would never have a black president. So you never know what's possible, Richard.
All righty, Dominic, stay with me. When we come back, we're going to switch gears here, and we're going to close this short with a lighter note. A big event in the world of sports today, Women's World Cup, mess that is the New York Knicks. We'll talk about that and more. Stay with us.